JetBrains Rider. Before we start, just wanted to ask, is any one of you using JetBrains Rider already? Nobody? Okay. Anyone who has heard about JetBrains Rider before? Okay, at least a couple, that's good. Anyone using ReSharper? Okay, that's also good. So the main goal of this talk is to give you a nice overview of what JetBrains Rider is and what it can do for you. And I think I have 3 or 4 slides about it, and that's it, and the rest is going to be demos. Do note, even if you don't use Rider, but you're currently a ReSharper user, there may be some tips and tricks that I will show you that you can also be using in ReSharper. All right, I'm Maarten Balliauw. My French is horrible, so that's why I'm doing this session in English. I'm from Belgium as well. Interested in everything that's web related, so if you want to follow me on my blog or on Twitter, I try to post on that quite often, which is not as often as I would like to nowadays, but still, it's okay. I'm a developer advocate at JetBrains, which is why I'm doing this talk, and at night I build MyGit, which you may also be using. Right, Rider. What is Rider? Why would you use Rider and so on? Well, Rider is an alternative to Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. So the idea is with .NET Core coming around, with the fact that Microsoft is starting to focus on having multiple platforms where you can run your .NET code on, we at JetBrains decided it's finally time to also come up with our own IDE, which is based on ReSharper. So it's also lightweight, pretty much like, it's less lightweight than Visual Studio Code, for example, but it's a full-featured IDE that has everything you want for your coding needs. So an editor, coding assistance, navigation, there's refactorings in there, etc. And a lot of built-in tools as well. If you're using Docker, for example, you can manage your Docker containers or Docker images from within Rider. If you want to install Nougat packages, you can do so as well. And even if you want to test, for example, a RESTful web API, you can basically craft your HTTP requests in Rider and test your API that is running on some server or on your local hosts. The nice thing is it's built on top of ReSharper and IntelliJ, which means that we have a lot of plugins already available because a lot of the ReSharper plugins will work in Rider, as well as the plugins that are available for IntelliJ, which we use for our other IDEs. And that's it. I think I'm through with my slides. So I will go take a seat and show you a couple of things in Rider. Can you still hear me okay? Good, okay. Let's maybe move it a little bit up. Okay, so Rider. This is Rider. It's an IDE and it looks like pretty much any IDE that is out there. You have a space where you can do coding and so on. And you have a space where you have a solution explorer where you can see all of your projects that you have, etc. So not really different, apart from maybe that in here, it's on the left side of the screen, and in Visual Studio, it could be on the right side of the screen. But apart from that, it's pretty much like any standard IDE that is available. Now, Rider gives you the option to do a lot of things using keyboard shortcuts. So just like in ReSharper, there's a lot of things that you can do if you know how to work with the keyboards. But imagine you are just new to Rider or just new to ReSharper. What you would not want to do is start learning all of those shortcuts at once before you start using the product. Which is why in Rider we have a go-to everything that you can use. So if you do a Control-T, you are basically searching everywhere in the application. If you remember the Control-T shortcut, you can search for anything in the application. I can search for classes. You can see I can search for iViewEngine. I can search for files that are in there as well. If I search, for example, for a MD file or a JS file or something like that, you will see that all those files are being found in this search everywhere. A nice thing is that it also searches in tool windows and settings and so on. So imagine I want to work with the Nougat tool window, but as you can see, there's no easy way to go there. Well, what I can do is just Control-T, search for Nougat, and you will see that the Nougat tool window is found, and I can just jump to that Nougat tool window and start working with the Nougat packages in my project. But before we do that, let's see how we can navigate around just our code base. So I'm using the NancyFX project here. Anyone heard of that one? It's a web application building framework, and it has a lot of projects, which makes it interesting to navigate through. So I know in Nancy there's an interface called iViewEngine. If I want to search for that one, I can just search for iViewEngine and do a lot of typing and then navigate there. Or I could just search for part of the iViewEngine name. So for example, iViewEngine, and it will still find it. The nice thing is, because we use camel casing in the class names or the interface names, I could also do something like IVE, and it will still find my iViewEngine because IVE matches the camel case letters in my type name there. Just enter, and I can go there, and you see I navigate there, get syntax highlighting, and everything else there. What I can do from here is navigate to derived types. So of course my interface will have an implementation somewhere in code, and I may want to navigate there. There's a couple of shortcuts that I can use. I can use Alt backtick, and I get a nice window where I can navigate to, for example, the implementation. Now again, if I don't remember the shortcut for this, I can just do Control T, the only shortcut you should remember, and go to implementation. And somewhere in this window, implementing members, you will see that this will actually be found. It's not as convenient, but if you're still learning the shortcuts, it's a way to go around in Rider. Now let's go to the implementation of iViewEngine. As you can see, there's different implementations of iViewEngine, and I can select them here and navigate there if I want. Now, one thing to remember in Rider, and a lot of things in ReSharper actually as well, is that you can search pretty much everything in the IDE. So for example, if I would be in my Solution Explorer and I wanted to search for forms, for example, I can just start typing forms and it will find those things. And if I now use the arrow keys, I will only navigate between those and quickly jump to a certain project in my solution. Same thing when navigating to my implementation of my view engine. If this is more than the number of implementations that you see here, I could just search for example, Markdown view engine, again with these camel humps, and just start typing, and I am able to jump in there and go to my Markdown view engine. Same thing in here. I can navigate to, for example, my parents, or my base symbol, or usages of symbol, and so on. Or I can navigate to member. Alt / just like in Visual Studio, and I can navigate to, for example, my constructor, and again I can search for Markdown view engine and jump to my constructor, for example. Now, a nice thing is that ReSharper not only provides you this navigation to a certain type, to a certain file, and so on, it also helps you discover where you are making use of one of these classes. So imagine I want to figure out where iViewEngine is used in my project. Again, I can do Alt backtick, say, okay, find usages of symbol, and Rider will show me a nice UI where I see all the usages of this interface, and I can quickly navigate there. And again, if I want to search, I can say, for example, Markdown view engine, and again, I will search between just those classes that match this specific search that I'm doing. Right. There's a couple of other navigations in there. So if you're more of a mouse-oriented person, you can do the same thing. You can just control-click on things. So if I control-click on iViewEngine, you will see it gets underlined and becomes somewhat of a hyperlink. Well, I can navigate to my view engine. If I want to navigate to my view engine startup context here, again, I can just control-click and navigate there. The nice thing is this is navigation within my project, within the classes that are in my project, but I can also navigate to external classes. So imagine I'm making use of JSON.NET, for example, and I want to navigate to a JObject, or imagine I'm in the Nancy code base here, and I want to navigate, for example, to the source code of the string class, which is of course not a part of my application. I can also control-click, and what Rider will do is decompile the string class from the .NET source codes and give me the source code for the string class, so I can see what is happening in there. Maybe for string this is not really useful, but imagine you are working with JSON.NET again. You can navigate, for example, to a JObject or a JArray or something like that and see how something is implemented and how it will work in your code. Now, this all works with .NET, it works with VB, it works with F#, it works in JavaScript and so on. So if I want to navigate, for example, to the prepend method in jQuery, we will navigate there as well. My microphone has its own life today. Right. There's a lot of additional navigations that are available. So if you do an Alt backtick, you see I can navigate to base symbols. I can find usages of a specific symbol. I can navigate to related files, types of this, to usages of the symbol, derived types, and so on. A nice thing is that I can also navigate to certain utilities. And I really have a microphone problem here. Let's try again. Let's maybe move this one. Sorry for that. Yes, okay. So I can also navigate to, for example, the Windows Explorer from here. Whichever class that I'm in, I can navigate to, for example, a command prompt and open a command prompt in the folder where my file is located here, which is pretty nice to do, and it works everywhere in every single type that is in my project. All right. There's a lot more in terms of navigation, but again, I just want to give you a quick overview of whatever is possible and hope to give you some tricks as well. So I would leave the rest for you to explore. Other things that are in Rider are, of course, code inspections and code analysis. You may have seen this in Visual Studio, you may have seen this in ReSharper. Whenever you open a file in Rider, you also get automated code analysis on the file. So in here we can see there's this big exclamation mark saying that I have one error in my file, 2 warnings and a couple of suggestions. Well, that is true. And if I click on my error or view my error, I can see that I'm using an inconsistent body style for something. So in here, it basically says me, okay, you can improve this code because you said you want to use expression body properties. You should rewrite it to an expression body property. The green squiggle is a suggestion. The red squiggle is basically an error that will also come up when I compile my codes. So in here, I return an integer and I'm returning a string here. So obviously that's wrong. Now what Rider does is it gives me the red light bulb and says, okay, I can fix this for you. I can say Alt-Enter and I can change either the type of my property getDelay to string so that the function signature matches whatever I'm doing, or I can say call convert to int 32 and parse my string as an integer. Not the best solution here in this case, because the best solution would just be returning the number as such. So let's do that. This other one is a code style setting. So basically I configured Rider to say, look, whenever you write a function, you should return it as an expression bodied property or an expression bodied member. Well, I can do that and just Alt-Enter, say, okay, to expression bodied property, and Rider will rewrite the function for me. Same thing with other code styles. So for example, if I say string foo equals bar, what will happen is Rider, in this case, gives me an error saying string is not something that I can use. I should use var. Now, the reason that this is an error is because I configured it as an error in my code style. So what I can do is, for this inspection, use var. I can say, okay, the severity should be lower and it should just be a suggestion or a warning. I can do that from here and it will be fixed for my entire project and everything will have to adhere to these code style settings from now on. Again, I still haven't fixed it, but I changed the severity. So you've seen that this went from error to just a suggestion with a green squiggle underneath. And again, I can just Alt-Enter and use var there. Right, there's a couple of other things. Anyone has been around long enough to have seen the JetBrains t-shirts with I see that codes? Yeah. That is because we actually see that code. So in here you see my usings are being unused, they are grayed out, so I can just Alt-Enter and remove them there. Same thing if I do something here, say I return from my function, and after my return I write some other codes, let's say 1. You will see that it's also grayed out because I will never reach this code and this code can safely be removed and I can just remove it. The nice thing is that all these inspections, so in here you see that the return statement is not needed. The nice thing is that all of these inspections are searchable in one file, so I can fix them in one file. But imagine I use string and I want to use var in my entire project. What I can do is Alt-Enter and say, okay, use var everywhere in this file, everywhere in my current project, or everywhere in my solution, and Rider will update everything for me in my entire project. By the way, you also see that Alt-Enter always includes the context. So in this case, I had an error or a warning or a hint, and you will see that I can use var and manage this inspection. But there's also always a couple of useful actions that I can do. So for example, I can navigate to, refactor, inspect, etc. based on where I'm located in the code. And again, everything in Rider is searchable. So if I search for generate here, you will see that all the other actions pop up in this thing. So again, if you only remember Control-T and Alt-Enter as a shortcut, you can do pretty much anything you want to do in Rider. Right, other inspections that are there. There's a couple of them. There's actually 2,300 of those in Rider. And the nice thing is it will check really everything. So even if I have something wrong in my XML comments, say I change this parameter name, it will actually complain that it cannot resolve this symbol and that I can either remove this tag or I should fix this tag. If I inherit from a different class and say, okay, look, my say hello is in here, and this one inherits this say hello, I should not put this documentation there at all. So as you can see, there's another suggestion here saying, look, you can just say add inherit doc, and you will inherit the documentation from the base class in this case, which is kind of nice twist, I think. Right, there's a lot more inspections, and again, for all the different languages that are supported in Rider and that you can use in there. What else is in there? Code generation, that's a nice one. Any one of you write all their DTO classes manually? Like you have a person object and you write the constructor and an equals method and all those things? Don't do it. There's a lot more interesting things to build, and Rider helps you build those more interesting things. So let's say I want to create a class person. And I should learn to type with a microphone in front of my head. Okay, my person will have a name and age as a property. So let's add a string property called name, and let's maybe add an integer property called age. What Rider offers is code generation. So whenever I use alt insert, I want to insert some codes, I can generate a constructor. I can generate overriding members. I can generate a deconstructor, equality members, etc., etc. So let's generate a constructor maybe. I want to generate a constructor for name and age, and I want this one to be public, or let's Rider figure it out for me. And I want to add a null check in there as well. Let's generate it, and as you can see, we now have a person class that uses a throw expression to check if the argument is actually null that I'm passing into my constructor. This code is all based on the language level that you use in your project. So if you are still on C# 5.0, for example, this will look different and will be an actual if statement that checks for your argument and then throws the expression instead. Now, that's one thing, but I still had to use a menu to do things. What Rider also gives us is more intelligent code snippets. So in Visual Studio, for example, you can do ctor and generate an empty constructor like this. Same thing in Rider. But what we do is also introspect your person class. We see there's public properties in there, so we will add a ctor p shortcuts, and if we invoke that one, it will actually do the same as our insert menu. Same thing in ReSharper, by the way. Right, let's add some more things. I also want to add equality members. I want to be able to compare two persons in my application. And maybe let's make it a database object and say my person has an ID, and I want to compare based on the ID of my person. So let's do that. Alt insert, generate equality members. And I can say, okay, when you want to check if a person is equal to another one, just check the ID. Or I can say also check the name and the age. And even if I select string properties, I can select if I want to compare case sensitive or not. Those things. But let's say just ID for now. And I also want to overload equality operators and implement the IEquatable interface. Let's go. And as you can see, a lot of code gets added. We get an equals methods, we get a get hash code, and we get overloads for the equals and not equals operators in there as well, which is kind of nice, I think. Now, let's say I also want to be able to check if a person is larger or smaller than another one, and let's maybe do that based on age. Again, I can generate relational members, select my age, for example, and say, okay, look, implement IComparable, overload relational operators, and be done with it. Again, I get a compare to, I get overloads for smaller than, larger than, etc., etc., without writing any code myself. This is typically also the type of code that you would copy-paste and you forget to adapt something and then introduce a bug that way. So instead of copy-pasting, just generate it and it will be much quicker to do. Now, this is kind of simple because Rider can figure out whatever is in your class and what it can do. There's a couple of other interesting things. So imagine we want to add a photo to the person as well. Let's say that's a stream. It will be a byte stream that contains the image of my person, and let's say it's called photo. What I can do again is do code generation and add like a constructor that takes the stream and so on. But there's something else that I should do here. Stream is disposable. which means my person should actually also be idisposable, because the stream would otherwise be a memory leak or a potential memory leak in my application. So let's say I want to implement idisposable. And what you get is a warning, an error again, because I didn't implement idisposable yet. So let's fix that, Alt-Enter, and say implement missing members. That's what you normally expect from an IDE. And what will happen is this. You get a dispose method that says throw not implemented exception, and I still have to figure out what I want to do. Rider is a little bit smarter about this, and instead of just implementing members, let's do an undo, yes. Instead of just implementing members, I can also say, okay, generate the dispose pattern for me. Rider knows about the dispose pattern, and it will detect that photo is a stream and also idisposable, and that it should be disposed of. I can add a null check. I can say, okay, I also have some unmanaged resources that I have to dispose, and based on these options, when I click OK, I get an implementation of my dispose method there as well. The nice thing is, again, it's language feature specific. So if you're on C#5, for example, this will just become a null check instead of the Elvis operator that we have in there. Right, a couple of other things. Anyone doing XAML development or makes use of iNotify property changed? Okay, a couple of folks. iNotify property changed is basically an interface that allows you to notify someone else that something changed in your code, in your class. So for example, if I would set the name, iNotify property changed is like a contract that says, okay, when the name changes, inform this calling class. Well, what I can do is, again, implement iNotify property changed. I get, again, a squiggly and say implement missing members, and that would mean I would have to do things manually. But Rider knows about iNotify property changed and can implement it for me. What it will do is basically, yeah, fine, add a non-property changed method for me that automatically invokes the property changed event for me. That's one thing. So it implements this method for me, and I can now use this if I start adding new properties. Now, I already have some properties, and I just want to make name and age, for example, implement iNotify or make use of this iNotify property changed method. What I can do is Alt-Enter and say, okay, convert this one to a property with change notification. We get a backing field, so we have a private string name, and our name property now simply checks if the name really changed. If it changed, it will set it, and if it's set, it will call onProperty changed, which is quite nice. So far, the only code that I wrote was 4 properties and 2 interface names on this class, which is quite nice to have, I would say. What else do we have? Let's go to my list a little bit. Right, there's a couple of other things in the editor. One of the nice things is that I can move code around. So imagine that I want to move this line to the top of my method. What I can do is simply press a couple of keys, Control, Shift, Alt, and then use the up and down keys, and I can move this code around. And as you can see, the code inspection will see that the other code is no longer reachable and can safely be removed. The nice thing is I can also move this and other to the other side if I use the other arrow keys. So I can just make use of my arrow keys and just hold my keyboard to move the code around, which can also be quite nice to flip something to the other side and so on. All right, something else that we have in here is multiple cursors, which is also really nice. Where can I do this? Okay, let's do it here. Imagine for a couple of methods, I want to throw a not implemented exception. I want to add some code on multiple places in my code base. Well, my cursor is here now. If I, again, hold Control, Shift, Alt and click, I will start creating multiple cursors. And as you can see, we now have multiple cursors blinking. I can enter. You will see the enter on all the different cursors. And I can just say, okay, throw new not implemented exception. I even get code completion on one of my cursors. I complete, and I get a not implemented exception everywhere in this class, which is, again, kind of nice. This is nice for writing codes, but it's also nice if you have, for example, imagine you have something that says names, and the names are Marco, who is in the room, it's Martin there, Steve is in there, and so on. Well, what I can do is add multiple cursors and electricity. Yeah, there we go. We'll sit in the dark, I guess. I can add multiple cursors on a couple of locations like this and just add enters there and start building an array from a string, for example. So I can do those things as well. Is there any chance we can get some more light again? Yeah, sort of. It's nice and cozy, I guess. All right, so that's for editing, I think. There's a couple of more things in editing. This is also a trick that works in ReSharper. I switched projects to an ASP.NET MVC project. Anyone using those? And now I can still see. Yes, there's a couple. Good. In my ASP.NET MVC project here, I created a HTML helper. So you know that you can create helper functions that you can use in your views that render some code in HTML when you actually run the application. So what I did was I added a login link HTML helper that takes a controller and an action. And my login link helper looks like this. It's basically some code that extends my HTML helper that takes the controller name, takes the action name, and based on that builds an action link that has a login link that will be rendered on my page. No rocket science, but just something that I want to make use of. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but I take controller and then action as the parameters to this function. While in my view, I have action and controller. So without me knowing, I actually introduced a bug in this application, and this will probably break at runtime, because typically I don't compile my views up front, and this will break at runtime, and there's no way to check if this is wrong, actually. A nice thing is that Rider and ReSharper have this notion of so-called, you can decorate your methods, you can decorate your parameters and so on with certain attributes. So if we change our function signature, and instead of making use of the regular one, we add ASP MVC controller to our controller parameter and ASP MVC action to our action methods, Rider and ReSharper will actually be smart enough to know, okay, even if this is a string, I know for code completion, for navigation and so on, that I should look into the list of controllers that are in this project to give you the things that you want to work with. So if you go back to our view, you will see that now we get red text that says basically, okay, we didn't find the controller named index, and we didn't find the action named home. And as you can see, if we swap them and just make it home and index, it will work, and we actually get navigation there as well. So I can now control click and go to my index method in my home controller, even though this method just takes strings. Nice thing is, even though it takes strings, I can still use my home controller here and actually get code completion for the controller names in my application, which is also nice. If I want to use the about controller, for example, or there is no about controller, there's only a home controller, I can still use the controller there, and you get code completion, you get a list of all the actions that are there, you get navigation, inspections, etc. Right. Another nice one in the editor is, I think, language injections. I know it's typically something you don't really want to do, but every once in a while there's this situation where you have to write, for example, some JavaScript code inside a C# string, or some JSON inside a C# string and things like that. It happens, you always feel dirty when it happens, but it still happens in a code base. What Rider gives us is a feature called language injections. So imagine, let's start Notepad for a second. We are getting back some lights. Let's start Notepad and write some JSON. Let's say I want to have some person type of class where I have a name, Maarten, and age, now I have to think 34, yep. I can copy paste this text and then paste it in a string. So imagine I have to use this JSON data in my application. What would typically happen if you paste it here? You get something really, really ugly. What Rider does is it gives us the option to escape pasted text. So it recognizes that there are quotes in my string that I just pasted, and it will escape my text for me. Okay, nice, my JSON is in there. But still, if I do something like this, I know my JSON is broken, but Rider doesn't know my JSON is broken. Unless I say Alt-Enter and say, okay, look, this string is an injected language of type JSON. And all of a sudden you get syntax highlighting inside of that string, and you see that there are red squigglies saying, okay, look, there's something wrong with the syntax of your JSON, and I should add my my quote again in there, which is also really, really nice, I think. We can do the same thing with CSS, for example. If we have some CSS and messing up my codes. If we have some CSS and we want to add, for example, a class named X, and we want to give it a color named color red, again, we get no highlighting, we get no error checking. So if I would say color is RD, then still my code will compile, but probably I have an issue in my actual application. What I can do is again say, okay, look, this string is CSS, and I will get syntax highlighting. I will get error checking saying, look, this is a color that doesn't really exist. And I even get code completion within my string in C#, which is, I think, kind of mind-blowing, unless you're really used to mind-blowing things in there. Right, this not only works for this case, but it also works for things like regular expressions, for example. So let's go back to our Nancy project. And I think we had a hello world type of thingy in there. Imagine I want to validate this string and check if it is alphanumeric. So what I could do is writing something like if not regex.match, regex.isMatch, right? What I can do is add a regular expression and say I want to add A to Z and so on to check if my name is alphanumeric. It's a really crappy regex, but still you get the idea of what I'm trying to achieve here. Can numbers be part of the name? Let's just go with this and say we want to add a couple of those. Not the best regex, but still I can say something like, okay, if this happens, throw a new exception saying that my parameter is invalid. The nice thing is you've already seen that while I was typing this regular expression, you see this yellow part pop up. And Rider actually knows that for this class, all these methods take a regular expression and will automatically mark it as a language injection that contains a regular expression. The nice thing is that I will get code completion. If I do a control space, I will get all the different types of regular expressions that I can add with a small explanation of what they mean. So for example, I want to check if it's any character except a backslash or a new line and things like that. I can do all those things and basically get completion for my regular expressions. Again, also available in ReSharper in Visual Studio. Right, some other things. Do I have another project? Yes, I have another project. Postfix Completion. That's a really nice one. Let's go to this one. Let's say we have an array integers, and let's say it's an array containing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. What I can do is if I want to do a for each over this array or any collection, I can just write for each and use the template and say, okay, I want to loop integers and then say it's an int or a var, depending on your code style. Let's go with var and call it I and then start writing my code there. That's nice. Rider helps me in writing this for loop, but I can do it actually even nicer. I can just say integers dot for each, and it generates all that for me, and I can immediately start typing whatever I want to do. Same thing with if and so on. I can check variables if they exist. For example, JSON.if, sorry, string.is null or white space JSON.if. If I do that, I will get an if statement that checks if my string is null or white space. So those postfix completion things work on pretty much any typical language construct that you have. So ifs, for each loops, for loops, switch statements, and so on. It's really nice to have those in there as well. Right. One that I forgot so far is refactorings. Rider is really strong in making refactoring work. So let's go back to our iView engine. And in our iView engine, I want to basically refactor the name of my iView engine. A simple rename refactoring, I can do Control-RR, and that will bring up the rename. Again, if I don't know what I want to do, I can just Alt-Enter, for example, and say rename, and I will get all those rename actions in there as well. Let's make it iView engine 2 instead of iView engine. Not really useful refactoring in this case, but let's go with this one. The nice thing is that Rider will also allow you to search in comments and string literals. So imagine I have a comment that says to do update iView engine, and I would rename my iViewEngine to iViewEngine2, what will happen is that Rider also detects that my comment contains the type name iViewEngine and will be able to replace it for me as well. It will also update all the calls. So whenever I call ViewEngines, for example, it will change it to ViewEngine2s, which is ridiculous, but that's probably because my example is ridiculous. But you get the picture. It will apply the refactoring everywhere in my code base and make sure it all works. Right. So that's one refactoring. There's a couple more. I could use my move my ViewEngine, for example, to another folder or to another namespace. If I do that, Rider will update all the different namespaces in the application for me, make sure all the using statements are correct and so on, basically ensuring that my code does not break whenever I do this refactoring. Now, refactorings are always context sensitive. So for example, if you have your cursor on string, you cannot rename string, so there will be no renaming there. But if I'm on iViewEngine, there's other refactorings that are available. I can always use the refactor menu to see which ones are available in this specific case, so that's quite a few. Or I can just use Control-Shift-R, which is the refactor this menu, and that one will give me only the refactorings that apply at this location in the source code. If I go to something else, to my comment here, for example, we will see that there's no refactorings at all. If I go to my string there, I will see different ones, etc. So based on the context of where my cursor is located, I will see different things in there. Right, how much time do we have left? A little bit, awesome. What else is in there? To finalize the editor part, there's one additional feature. So typically, every file you create in Rider, same thing for Visual Studio, is typically a part of your project. So what I can do is Alt-Insert here and say I want to add a package.json file, for example. That thing will be part of my project. Now, what if I want to write some code or have a scratchpad saying, okay, these are the things that I should still do today? Well, what I can do is create a scratch. And a scratch file is basically a file that is not part of your project yet, but still gives you a lot of the features that are available. So I can create a scratch for a C# file, for example, and my C# scratch will have syntax highlighting for C#. Not really a lot, and there's some basic stuff in there, but still I get some basic syntax highlighting in a file that just contains my train of thoughts instead of being part of the project. The nice thing is, once I decide that my scratch can become part of my application or of my project, I can basically just save as and make it part of my application. If not, it will simply disappear and be gone forever. So you can send it to interactive as well. So if you have a scratch file, let's create one. Let's say a C# scratch, and I say var x equals string equals Maarten, and I just print x. What I can do is select all, Alt-Enter, say, okay, send to C# interactive, and I will see that it prints Maarten in this case. So C# interactive, good question, is also part of Rider, and I can send it to C# interactive as well. It's not a full-fledged scripting console, but you can still do things like this to test, for example, which parameters a datetime takes and things like that. Yeah. Nice thing with C# interactive, by the way, is that every single command that you run in there is stored, and I can use the up and down arrows to replay parts of my previous commands. Or I can just make use of the history button here, which will also show the recent commands there. And if I don't have a scratch file, but I am working with a scratch and saying, okay, I want to do datetime.now as well and print that to console, I can get a transcript of my C# interactive. So if I click transcript, a new scratch file will be created that contains all the different commands that I executed on the C# interactive console there, which is also useful if you want to copy whatever you have been working on in there. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it for the editor. Now, what else do you typically expect from an IDE? Source control. Let's go for source control. Nancy has a nice source control. They have a lot of history as well. And in source control, you see that you always get your local changes. So whatever changes I currently have, I can see them in here. If I say, okay, show me a diff to the previous version of iViewEngine, for example, you will see that I added this comment and so on. I can commit. So if I commit from here, I can commit all my files. I can select the files that I want to commit, add a commit message, and so on. Again, I get a nice div there, and I can still make some basic changes. No, I cannot make some basic changes anyway. I can sign off the commit if I want to add Maarten as the approver, for example. I can do that. And it will even search in the history of my Git repo to find all the different authors that are in my Git repo. Nice thing is, before commit, I can reformat or rearrange or optimize imports and so on, and also check for to-do comments. If there's a to-do comment in my code, by default, Rider will basically check for to-do comments, and before you commit, warn you saying, okay, look, you still have a to-do in there. Maybe you want to first fix this before you send it off to source control. What else is in there? The typical things that you expect from a source control system. The nice thing is there's also an extensive and quite powerful log available. So imagine you want to find some certain commit that is in your source control repo. If I search for OCD, for example, I will immediately find that OCD is bad and killing off the OCD cleanup commit. So apparently Nancy is quite prone to OCD. Nice thing is, if you have a large history, this is all cached, so the search that you perform here will be really fast to search. I can still filter based on branch, based on user, based on date, and select even a date range in which I want to search for a specific commit, etc. For every commit, I can see all the different files that changed, and again, from there, I can open a diff or compare with my local and so on, revert, things like that. Nice thing is, everything that I do here will also be printed to console. So if I would, for example, commit some files to my source control, what you will see is that in the console, you see the actual Git commands that has been executed. So if you want to become a Git command line professional, this is one way of doing it by learning how the IDE does it for us. Right, version control is kind of nice. There's something else that is really nice in Rider. So imagine anyone go to work by train or bus? Yeah, a couple, okay. Imagine you go to work by train and in the morning you check your email on the train and you see there's a new bug report for something, and on the train you decide, it's Belgium after all, that the train has a delay, and you have some time to actually start fixing that bug. So imagine we start writing a new class called bug fix, and my bug fix will contain a public void foo, and there is some code in there, and I save it, and then I remove this thing and say, okay, var x equals 1, and so on. And wonder, after all, I come at work, the train did its thing, and I arrive at work, and all of a sudden, my colleague who expected I would be there 1 hour earlier says, look, we have this other bug, can you please start working on that one immediately? You panic, and you go like, okay, everything that I was doing on the train, I'll get rid of it, either by rolling back Git history or whatever. I save and I start working on this new thing. In the evening, you travel back home and you realize, oh, right, I was working on this bug fix this morning, but oh, I removed all the code that was in my code base. Typically, you still have an undo if the application is still running, but what if you restart your laptop, which happens on Windows if you blue screen or something like that? The code is gone. You didn't commit, and the undo history is gone. Nice thing is, Rider has this concept called local history. It's not source control, but it's basically source control for your undo history, which would mean if I show history for a certain file or for a certain folder, I get all the different changes that were made there. So you can see I removed this piece of code. Well, I can restore it, and I'm good to go again. I can work on the train back home and complete what I started working on, even if I forgot to commit this thing. Nice thing is I get code completion in here as well. I can do some edits, and I also get code analysis. So you can see things that are potentially wrong. So for example, there's no XML comment on this one, etc. Really cool thing is that Rider also, whenever you do a refactoring, will store that refactoring in local history. So you will see the refactoring will get a name in the local history, and you can see all the changes that were made to this specific file, restore parts of it, restore it completely, etc. So that's really nice. Don't use it as a replacement for source control, of course, but it's really nice if you shoot yourself in the foot and want to get out again. Right, what else is in there? What else do you expect from an IDE? Debugging, thank you. That's another really nice one. So debugging. Let's switch projects to something really simple where we have a JSON file that contains some data. We read the data into a string, then we convert it into a list of persons, then we filter it, and then we print them to console. If I run this, you will see the most boring application ever. It prints my name. Wow. Now, I want to debug this one. So what I can do is simply place a breakpoint like you would expect and start debugging. Let's start debugging. Come on, Rider. Yes, there we are. So we get a debugger. Couple of things you see here. All the variables that are currently in scope are shown inside the editor so that I do not have to look down to my debug window and look at the different variables that are in there. Now I can simply easily see that this is some JSON. I can see some part of the data. If I step over, I can even see that this is now a list that contains 4 people, etc. So I can see whatever is in there. A nice thing is that I can do all the things that you would expect from a debugger. So step into, step over, etc. And so on. A really cool thing is that if I step into this one, print people, what you will see, damn it, I was too quick. Let's restart the debugger. What you should see is that when I want to step into print people, is that it will also go over all the statements that are in my Lambda. So normally you would just jump into print people. If I 11 into this statement, I will actually see the evaluation for every single person in my list and can see whatever is happening in there. So that's quite powerful and quite nice to have. Right, all other things are in there. So you get watches, you get variables, you can do things like updating a value that is in there and saying, okay, let's change the email for this one to something like foo. I can update those things, all the things that you would expect from a debugger. Nice thing is, whenever I navigate back in the stack or forward in the stack, I will again see all those things in my editor, which is really nice to have. The only thing I don't like currently is that my person is just printed as debugging demo.person. I would like to see some information about this person. Well, Rider 2 respects the debugger display attributes. So if I add the debugger display attribute and say, okay, I want to display name and email when the debugger is attached, when I now run the application again, we would see a name and an email in the editor instead of just the fact that this is a person class. There we go. So if we now F10, you will see that my person is currently this person, which is really nice. Those are all the things that you would expect from a debugger. Rider has a couple of really interesting features, I must say, that do some stuff for us. So imagine, let's refactor a little bit and extract this code into a method saying, make it a list, something like that. I think everyone has some portions of their code base where they have code like this, where you have print people and then make it as lists, 2 statements basically on 1 line of code, right? Well, if I run this code and debug it, and I'm interested in going into print people directly. Normally, what I would have to do is find my print people, put a breakpoint in there, and just F5 until I arrive in print people, right? The thing that Rider allows us to do is do a smart step into. Because if I would do a normal step into, I would go into make a list and then into all the things in there, and only then I would go into print people. And by the time I arrive in the method that I really wanted to debug, I typically lost track of what I was going to do and I go grab a coffee. What Rider does is it provides a smart step into. So instead of using F11 to step into print people and make it a list, what I can do is shift F7 and Rider will ask me into which method I want to step into. I can select my make it a list or print people and based on that step into the right methods. So if I want to skip the breakpoints that are in make it a list, I can just say go into print people and it will run until there, which is really, really nice. Right, a couple of other things. Breakpoints, you can right-click them and you can do things like adding conditions. So I only want to break if some condition is true and this will happen. Everything you would expect from a debugger. What I can also do is go into more and can configure some other options for my breakpoints. So what I can do is a basic breakpoint will always be enabled and will suspend the application, meaning that it will stop the application, pause execution, and show you what's going on. What I can also do is, if I have a breakpoint that I want to know that has been passed, but I don't want to always break on that breakpoint, I can say, okay, instead of suspending, just log something to the debug output, and then I can still see that we passed beyond this point in the application, but the application will not pause every time I do this. That's kind of nice. Imagine I have a large data set of 2,000 objects, and I know somewhere around object number 1,600, I have a bug and I want to start debugging from iteration 1500, for example. What I can do is make it a hit count breakpoint and say only if this one has been hit more than 1500 times, only then start suspending the application, which means the first 1500 times will just continue looping and only after that the breakpoint will hit. We can also make temporary breakpoints. So I want to know that this happens once, and after that I don't want to be bothered again during this session. Well, I can say remove once hits. It will just hit once and then be removed again. Now the one that I really, really like is the fact that I can also make dependent breakpoints. So imagine I have this print people methods, and I have a print person methods. Now, I know I have 4 people in this list, but I only want to have this print person methods to be hit when this one has been hit before. This is a bad example, I know, but imagine I want to make a dependent breakpoint on something. What I can do is say, okay, look, for this breakpoint, for my name, do not enable it unless some other breakpoint has been hit or an exception happens. Maybe you have some logging codes that you want to debug only when an exception happened in your application. You can do that here. Typically, when you would use this is, imagine you have like a message loop in your application where something runs every couple of seconds and you always want to pause in that execution. What you can do is only pause whenever some feature was accessed somewhere else in the application using these dependent breakpoints. Right, that's the debugger. I have 5 minutes left. I can give you Nougat. Hands up if you want to see Nougat. I can give you the REST client that is built in. Okay, that's almost on par. There's a lot more in Rider, but I will give you those 2, and then I fear I'm out of time. Maybe one more. There's a built-in terminal, and I can do things like echoing my name there. Okay, yeah, perfect. All right, we have a Nougat client in there as well. So the Nougat client in Rider is extremely fast compared to Visual Studio. Anyone have an obscure package name that they want to search for so I can prove it? Just yell a package name. Anyone? Okay, let's search for nlog. That's anyone using nlog? Okay, a couple of people, but it's a more obscure package that will definitely not be in the top 10 of packages on Nougat. Well, I can search for nlog. It's there already. So that's how fast Rider's Nougat client works. Everything you expect from a Nougat client is there. I can install, I can select the version, I can look at the frameworks, at the information, etc. I can upgrade, I can downgrade, works with the old project formats, works with the new project formats, and so on. The cool thing is that I can also make typos. So if I search, for example, for newtonsoft.jnos, it should find JSON, but apparently it doesn't today. But still, it's quite fast in discovering the actual package name. What else is in the Nougat client? You can configure your Nougat sources more easily. We have a list of all the different sources that are active in your project. You can select your source that you want to edit and add new feeds in there. So for example, I can add one that lives on some other feed somewhere. And the nice thing is if you have private feeds, you can also add username and password authentication in there immediately. So with Visual Studio, is anyone using private feeds? Does anyone trust the remember my credentials checkbox? Here you can actually trust to remember my credentials because they actually work in here. Right. If you open the caches tab, you may see a surprise. Not on my machine because I know I have to clean these out every once in a while. But Nougat does a lot of storing on your machine, and I have seen machines where there's like 40 gigabytes of hidden packages on your system, well, the Nougat client in Rider gives you a nice list of all the different caches that are available, and I can clear them from here if I want to, which is quite nice. Okay, other stuff in there. I have so much that I wanted to show you. There's a database client. If you work with different types of database, you can connect to it. So I'll just show you that I have a SQLite database with an address and a person, and I can do refactorings and I get navigation and so on. One really nice feature in there is that if I open a console and I want to, for example, run a query that joins a person with an address, let's rewrite my statement here. Let's say inner join address. What you will get is completion based on the foreign keys that Rider discovers in your database. So you see, I do not even have to write the fact that I want to link my address. I can just complete and my join statement is completed, which is nice. A cool thing is that in this console, I can also put question marks or add variables if you want. And if I would run this query, Rider will ask me for the person ID that I want to open. I can open my person ID, let's say 1, execute the query. Yeah, sure. And I get back some data from my database. There it is. Nice thing is I can export to CSV, I can export to HTML and so on, but I could also export to SQL inserts. So if I want to export some data to import it on a different database, I can do that from here. Right, that was the database client in a really, really quick nutshell. Okay, one more that I want to show you. The tools menu contains a number of interesting tools that you can use. For example, you can use C# Interactive or F# Interactive. You can access the Nougat client and so on. There's a couple more things, like, for example, testing of RESTful web services. If I have an API that I want to test, I can open a nice dialog in which I can, for example, query Google, add a path there, whatever you want. Add request headers, add request parameters if you want, and just execute the requests. And I get back HTML, I can export this, and so on. Now, this is nice, but typically you don't want to enter all those URLs manually and enter them every single time you want to test something. So there's another view on this client where you can say, okay, tools, show HTTP request history. You get a nice file where you can basically just craft your HTTP requests and say, I want to access www.devday.be and I want to set the user agent to Maarten. Is cool. I don't know. And then simply select this request, Alt-Enter, and say, okay, run devday.be, and I get back the contents, which is really nice. I can export this, I can share it with my colleagues to also help them test the API, but it's really like a scratch pad of all the requests that you want to run. I can do Alt-Enter, or I can even just click the run button there and get back the data as well. That's another nice one. Cool. I mentioned plugins when I started this presentation. I have 1 minute left, so I quickly want to show you plugins. There's a lot of plugins available in Rider that you can access from the plugin settings and then install either a JetBrains plugin, which JetBrains wrote, or install a plugin from the repository where third parties add their plugins. There's really a lot of them. I can keep scrolling through these lists. There's a couple that I really like, and one of those is the .ignore plugin. Third party, but imagine I start a new project and typically you want to start adding like a Git Ignore file. What I can do is say, okay, new ignore file for whatever source control system you are using. Say, maybe I'm using Team Foundation server. I want a TF ignore file. And what this plugin does is it gives me the typical frameworks that can be used in an application. It gives me the IDEs that can be used for an application and so on. And based on whatever I select in there, my ignore file will be built. So I think that's quite a useful plugin. Another really nice plugin that I really like when I feel empowered to do my work is the Power Modes plugin. You may wonder, what is that thing? Power Modes, let's install this one. No, that's not the right one. Where is Power Modes? I cannot type today. Yes, Power Mode. Install that one. Whenever you install a plugin, of course, you have to restart Rider, but I just want to end on the coolest plugin that is in the repository. Let's restart Rider. Should come up in a bit. or not. There it is. Okay, Rider is back. Let's open my debugging demo, and if you feel really empowered, you should really install the Power Mode plugin, because it gives you some nice things. Whenever you type, whenever you click, the screen will look like you are really powerful, and when you start coding, you will see all these explosions, and it's really cool. And if you have a playlist, it will even play music based on how furiously you are typing. So really, if you go away, there's one thing to remember: the Power Mode plugin is awesome. Right. I think that's it for now. There's much, much more in Rider. I hope I did give you a nice overview of whatever is in there. Do give it a try. It's a new IDE on the block. If you're used to ReSharper, it's really easy to switch to Rider. And if you just want to try something new, it's really nice. Thank you.